He was invisible at school until he understood the power of silence and presence. The invisible boy, feeling unseen and unheard in a crowded room. There is something uniquely painful about walking through the hallways and feeling like no one even noticed you were there. That was his everyday experience. Let's call him Daniel. For most of his early school life, Daniel felt more like a ghost than a student. He wasn't bullied, not exactly. That would have at least required someone to acknowledge his existence. Instead, he was simply overlooked, not chosen for group projects, not invited to birthdays, not mentioned in conversations. Even when teachers called on students, their eyes would pass over him like he was just another empty desk. He tried to understand why. Was it the way he dressed? The way he spoke? Or didn't? Was there something about him that just didn't register on other people's radar? Every morning he got up and tried to be someone worth noticing. He'd wear brighter clothes. He'd force a smile. He'd raise his hand even when he didn't know the answer. But somehow, the more he tried to push his presence outward, the more he felt like he was fading inward. There's a special kind of loneliness that exists in shared spaces. Sitting in a classroom filled with noise, laughter, energy, and feeling none of it directed at you. Over time, Daniel started internalizing a dangerous belief. Maybe I don't matter. And once that belief takes root, everything you experience starts to reinforce it. You begin to shrink, even if you don't mean to. You stop trying. You stop expecting anything to change. And that was the version of Daniel that existed for years, quiet not by choice, but by default. A boy living in the background of his own life. But what Daniel didn't yet know was that his invisibility wasn't a curse. It was a doorway, a hidden path to a deeper kind of strength. One not rooted in attention, but in awareness. One not about being the loudest in the room, but being the one everyone starts to feel, even without words. That moment of realization would come. But first, he had to sit with the silence and learn what it had to teach. The moment of quiet realization, discovering the power of observation. It didn't happen in a grand moment. There was no speech, no revelation handed down from above. It came, instead, during an ordinary afternoon, the kind that usually passed without meaning. Daniel was sitting in the back of his history class, staring out the window as the teacher talked about revolutions and empires. As usual, no one noticed him. But this time, something shifted. His eyes wandered from the trees, swaying outside to the students around him. The way one classmate kept tapping his pencil when he was anxious. The way another would glance toward the door every 5 minutes, waiting for the bell. He noticed how the popular kid, who always smiled and joked, gripped the bottom of his desk so tightly that his knuckles turned white. And the girl who seemed confident and untouchable, she kept checking her phone like she was waiting for something, anything, that might make her feel seen. In that moment, Daniel realized something powerful. Everyone was trying to be noticed. Everyone was speaking, performing, laughing too loud, or pretending to be busy. Not because they were full of confidence, but because they were trying to fill a void. And there he was, invisible, but aware. He saw what others didn't. He felt what others hid. And for the first time, he understood that his quietness wasn't weakness. It was a kind of sight, a sensitivity to the world that most people were too noisy to perceive. This realization didn't make him popular. It didn't suddenly pull him into the spotlight, but it planted a seed, the idea that maybe being on the edges wasn't about being small. Maybe it was about seeing the whole picture. Daniel began to lean into that silence. He started observing with purpose. Instead of wishing to be heard, he started listening. Instead of trying to force conversations, he waited for the right moments to speak. And when he did, people began to listen, not because he was loud, but because he had something real to say. What began as invisibility transformed into presence. And it all started with a moment of stillness, a window, and the courage to notice what others missed. Learning to embrace solitude instead of fighting it. For most of his life, Daniel had seen solitude as a punishment, a cruel confirmation that he wasn't enough. At lunch, he sat alone. At group projects, he was the last to be picked. Walking through the halls felt like floating through a world where everyone else was living, and he was simply existing. He used to dread those moments. The long walk home with only the sound of his own footsteps, the weekends when no one texted, the silent dinners where his family barely spoke. But something changed after his realization about observation. He stopped filling every quiet space with distraction. He stopped reaching for his phone or forcing noise into stillness. At first, solitude still hurt. It still made his chest tighten with the ache of invisibility. But then, little by little, he began to notice something deeper. When no one else was around, he could actually hear his own voice. He began to use his alone time differently. He read books he was genuinely curious about, not because they were assigned, but because they opened doors to new worlds. He started journaling, pouring out thoughts he didn't even know he had. He listened to music not to fill silence, but to feel something real. In the stillness, his mind slowed down. His thoughts took shape. And for the first time, he met a version of himself that wasn't hiding or trying to be anyone else. He discovered that solitude, when accepted rather than resisted, could be fertile ground. It gave him space to reflect, to heal, and to grow. He didn't have to perform or prove anything. He could just be. What once felt like isolation began to feel like clarity, like a mirror he could finally look into without fear. He stopped fearing Friday nights alone, and instead looked forward to them. That quiet space, once a prison, had become a sanctuary, a place where he was not invisible, but fully seen by the only person who truly mattered, himself. The day, he spoke less and was heard more. It happened on a Thursday, a regular, forgettable school day, or at least it seemed like it. Daniel had been changing quietly, slowly. He was no longer the boy trying to blend into the walls, nor the one chasing conversation just to feel less alone. He had started listening more, not just with his ears, but with his entire presence. He observed people's emotions, how their faces shifted during uncomfortable moments, how words often betrayed what their bodies tried to hide. That day, during a heated classroom discussion on morality in literature, Daniel sat in silence for most of it. He wasn't quiet because he was afraid, but because he was genuinely absorbing, listening, watching, understanding. Then, just before the class ended, he raised his hand. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention, but it carried something rare, calm, clarity, and depth. I think sometimes we judge people too quickly before we understand what pain they're carrying. The room fell still. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. No pretense, no need to impress. Just presence, just truth. Even the teacher paused. In that moment, Daniel realized something profound. Presence can be louder than volume. Silence, when chosen, is not weakness, it's power. Because when you speak from silence, people feel the weight of your words. After class, a classmate, one who had never really spoken to him, walked up and said, "That was actually deep." It wasn't flattery. It was surprise. Maybe even respect. It was the first time Daniel had truly been heard. Not because he shouted, not because he forced his way in, but because he had taken the time to understand and had the courage to speak only when it mattered. From that day on, he realized that you don't need to talk more to be seen. Sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one that speaks last. After listening, after thinking, after feeling. And that was the day Daniel stopped trying to be loud and started becoming real. How he used silence to build confidence and connection. There's something unusual that happens when you stop filling the space with noise. Daniel began to notice that the more he embraced silence, not as a gap, but as a choice, the more he grew comfortable within himself. For the first time, his confidence wasn't based on validation from others. It wasn't about laughter after a joke or getting picked for a group. It came from something quieter, something internal. He would sit at lunch, sometimes alone, sometimes with others. He didn't force conversation. He didn't try to impress. He simply existed, fully, present, calm, and people noticed. A girl from class once asked him, "Why are you always so quiet?" He smiled and answered, "Because I like listening first." There was a pause. Then she said something unexpected. "I wish I could do that. I always feel like I have to talk to not disappear." That's when it clicked for Daniel. Most people are afraid of silence. Not because it's empty, but because it reveals too much. But Daniel had learned something powerful. When you make peace with silence, you no longer depend on noise to prove your worth. You stop performing. You start connecting. Over time, his presence became magnetic. People began to trust him, not because he said a lot, but because when he did speak, it felt intentional, thoughtful, safe. And with every small connection, a conversation that mattered, a glance that carried weight, a shared silence that wasn't awkward, his confidence grew. Not the loud kind, not the arrogant kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need to be announced, because it's already felt. Daniel wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the most popular. But he was the one people looked to when they needed someone real. And it all started when he stopped trying to fill the silence and started listening to what it was teaching him. Moments that prove presence speaks louder than words. Presence is an invisible force. You can't touch it, you can't measure it, but you can feel it. And Daniel began to realize that while words may echo for a while, presence leaves a deeper mark. It started in the library. A girl from class, someone always surrounded by friends, sat 2 tables away from him. She was usually the center of every conversation, always smiling. But that day, her eyes were red. Her body was still, but tense, as if holding something in. Daniel noticed. Not in a dramatic way. He didn't stare. He didn't make a scene. He simply closed his book, stood up, and gently slid a folded note onto her table before walking away. The note read, "You don't have to pretend today. It's okay to not be okay." The next day, she passed him in the hallway. She didn't say a word, just nodded slowly, her eyes softer than before. That was enough. Another time, during group work, one of his classmates was getting mocked for a stutter. Daniel didn't yell. He didn't try to be the hero. Instead, when it was the student's turn to speak, Daniel looked at him, not with pity, but with patience. He waited. No rush. No discomfort. And when the boy finished, Daniel simply said, "That made sense. Thanks." No one teased after that. It wasn't about defending. It wasn't about lecturing. It was about presence, the kind that says, "I see you. You matter. You're safe here." People started feeling that around Daniel. Not because he had the right words, but because his energy said everything his mouth didn't have to. Presence, he discovered, isn't about attention. It's about intention. Being fully there. Not distracted. Not reactive. Just aware. And that awareness, that grounded energy, made people feel more human around him. He was still quiet, still reserved, but his presence, calm, intentional, and unwavering, began speaking louder than the voices trying to be heard. The shift in how others perceived him. Daniel didn't notice it at first. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible. There were no fireworks, no grand gestures, no standing ovations. But one morning, as he walked into school, he realized something had shifted. People no longer brushed past him like he was furniture. They made space. His name, once forgotten or mispronounced, started to sound familiar in the mouths of others. When he raised his hand in class, teachers gave him the floor, not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest. When he spoke, people listened, not because he was loud, but because he was deliberate. He began to see something in their eyes that wasn't there before. Respect. Not the kind you demand, the kind you quietly earn. It was the respect that comes when you show up fully in who you are. When you don't try to be louder, funnier, or cooler. You just become undeniably real. People started coming to Daniel for help. Not because he had all the answers, but because he didn't pretend to. He listened deeply. He didn't give advice unless asked. And when he did, his words were careful, considered, and grounded. Girls who once ignored him now greeted him with sincerity. Guys who used a joke at his expense now nodded at him in the hallways. Subtle, silent acknowledgments of someone they couldn't quite define, but could no longer ignore. He hadn't changed his clothes. He hadn't learned a new skill. He hadn't transformed into someone else. He had simply grown into himself. And in doing so, he became someone others wanted to be around. Daniel wasn't invisible anymore, but not because he forced himself to be seen. He had become visible because he had learned to see. And those around him could feel that. He saw them, not for who they pretended to be, but for who they were underneath. And, somehow, that made people feel safer near him. Seen, understood. It wasn't popularity he gained. It was something much more lasting. Presence with gravity, the quiet pull of someone who knows exactly who they are and doesn't need to prove it. His lasting impact and the quiet confidence he carried forward. By the time Daniel graduated, his story wasn't the one that made headlines in the yearbook. He wasn't the prom king, the valedictorian, or the most likely to succeed. But if you asked anyone who truly paid attention, they'd tell you that Daniel was the one who changed the most, not outwardly but deeply. His legacy wasn't loud. It didn't come with applause or celebration. It came in the moments that often go unnoticed. The classmate who stood up straighter because Daniel once believed in them. The anxious freshman who found calm just by sitting next to him in silence. The teacher who saw in his eyes a rare depth and chose to teach with more heart because of it. Daniel had become someone whose presence altered the air in the room, not because he demanded attention, but because his silence carried weight. The way he listened, without judgment, without rushing, made others feel like they mattered. In a world obsessed with noise, he had mastered the power of stillness. And that made all the difference. When he walked into a room, he didn't shrink. He didn't try to be someone he wasn't. He walked in slowly, breathed deeply, and owned the space, not by filling it, but by grounding it. This quiet confidence wasn't something he had faked. It had been earned moment by moment, through discomfort, through growth, through loneliness, through observation. He knew what it felt like to be unseen, unheard, and he never wanted to make others feel the same way. In college, Daniel didn't become a celebrity or a social butterfly. He became a steady presence in a world that often spun too fast. He found his passion in psychology, fascinated by the subtle patterns of human behavior. His curiosity, once inward, expanded to the world around him. He wanted to understand people, not to fix them, but to truly see them. Years later, when people described him, they rarely used words like charismatic or outgoing. They said things like, "He made me feel understood," or "He never judged me," or simply, "There was something about him." Daniel left school not just with knowledge, but with wisdom, the kind you can only earn through pain, reflection, and presence. And as he stepped into his future, he carried with him the quiet, steady confidence of someone who knew his worth, not because others told him, but because he had once been invisible and chose to see himself anyway.